the African invasion of Spain. The Africans, Berbers, and Arabs gave Spain the greatest material civilization it ever had before or since. Yet, the Africans, Berbers, and Arabs so depressed Iberian or Spanish culture to the point it hasn't recovered to this very day. If you go to Spain right now, when they point to some achievement, it is some achievement the Moors left behind. They still hadn't recovered. I say every invader depresses the culture of a people and takes more away ultimately than they gave. I'm talking about the Europeans coming to the world, doing the whole world more harm than good. And if he say he is the bringer of the light, he is a liar and a hypocrite, because he brought no light, he put out the light. And that he is in a position right now of losing the world, and each time he called an age his golden age is that age when he has somebody else to exploit outside of Europe. And that he never had a golden age when he had only Europe to feed on. He is being pushed right now to a point where he is being deprived of the land and the resources outside of Europe, when he would rather blow up the world if he can't rule it. And so the people of the world had better protect themselves or prepare to go back in chains, because he'd rather enslave it or destroy it if he can't rule it. The Spaniards have been mixed with African blood even since the Carthaginian time. Because any time the Spaniards say he's pure white, I mean, don't ever laugh directly in his face. I mean, be respectful. I mean, cup your hands and turn your head to one side. They've been mixed with us so long. It's just impossible to find a single Spaniard on the face of the earth who don't have at least a few drops of us. They used to boast about it, but now in this country, you know, and if they can pass the taxi cab test, they try to pass the color test. Don't argue the point, you know. If you can pass it, pass. All right, good luck. Good luck, bud. Don't make no fuss about it.
But again, I understand. You see, you have been taught by Alex Haley and others that your history started in the slave trade. But they don't even tell you how the slave trade started. They blame you for enslaving yourself. They say your ancestors sold you up. Nice statement. So I asked the guy, what country, what was the name of the king? Oh, don't worry about that, they sold you out. As if I don't know that the slave trade started with the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church by the name of Martin V and Reverend Bartolomeo de las Casas on the island of Hispaniola, now called Haiti and Santo Domingo. You see, nobody told you it's time to get sorry, to feel bad when some Haitians were being slaughtered on the coast of Florida. That's what it is. If you send a people back to sea on the condition where they were, that's genocide. But you see, you didn't feel anything because you weren't taught to realize that the Haitians are your brothers and sisters because you don't know that the first Africans to be brought in slavery was not taken from Africa, but from Spain and carried to Haiti, then called Hispaniola, in 1506, under the aegis of the Pope of the Roman Church and Bartolomé de las Casas. But how did you get in Spain? That was 1506. But you went into Spain, which was then called Iberia, Spain and Portugal and southern France, as conquerors yourself in 711, under the leadership of Tariq, for whom the Rock of Gibraltar is now named Gibraltariq. Nothing in your education, because there's nothing in your textbooks about any of this. So you'll have to go to Spain. Luckily, at the University of Barcelona, where I attended for 2 years, there are these documents, and I had never known anything about them. I hadn't known that the Africans called Moors had ruled Spain from 711 until 1485. The last of them losing power at a place called Granada. I was always wondering, why is it that 90% of all the songs coming out of Spain was singing to La Morena, the black woman? So how come in this country 90% of all the songs, the records, the tapes, everything is La Morena this and La Morena that? It is when I went there I found out La Morena raised hell in Spain. But we can start with that, because there is where our institutions of learning has decided to start civilization. Yet the Greeks are only here from at least 1000 before the Common Era, or before the Christian era, as you would prefer to say. Let us just, for example, cite one. And that particular person would be Hippocrates. And I'm sure that you heard of Hippocrates. And when you consider that Hippocrates wasn't born until 333 BC, or before the Common Era, yet in your education you were told that Hippocrates is the father of medicine. That's a lie. There's no way that I can say about it other than it's a lie. A lie is a lie, whether it's in the university or in the church. How could Hippocrates be the father of medicine when the first time you see him, he is in Egypt learning medicine from Africans? There are numerous papyri, medical papyri on medicine. The nearest to Hippocrates is at least 1,300 years before he was born. For example, we have what is known as the Hettus papyrus, the Ebers papyrus, and now the so-called Rockefeller papyrus, the Edwin C. Smith papyrus. All of these papyri go back to as early as 3100 BC. The man who Hippocrates took an oath that he would practice medicine according to this man, this African, whom the Greeks call Aesculapius in the Hippocratic Oath, a man by the name of Imhotep, died. He practiced medicine and died 2,500 years before the birth of Hippocrates. And you are telling me that the medical school and the pre-medical historians don't know this? They don't know it because, unfortunately, Imhotep had a high visibility like myself, otherwise called black. They don't know that the Ebers papyrus by Hatshepsut, dealing with Planned Parenthood, I said Planned Parenthood, 1,550 years before the birth of Jesus the Christ, is out there, when every medical journal in 1961 published copies of the Ebers papyrus. And we could go on with the papyri with respect to all kinds of diseases that the Africans had produced, both in Egypt and Ethiopia and Sudan, and a place then called Puanit, now called Somalia. But that would be satisfactory, but let us take the kind of education that we do have. We are in a chapel, and we have been told about an immaculate conception and virgin birth. We have been told about the beginning of the world with Adam and Eve. We have been told about a man by the name of Cain who slew his brother Abel. And we've been told that all of these things only happen once. And they go back to the Old Testament, or otherwise called the Torah, or the Pentateuch, or the Chumash. Those are names for what you call the Old Testament. But we have never been told that they are only copies of stories that predated them by thousands of years. Let us put them. And those who teach them, if in fact they did any research, must know their lives. That is providing that they have never gone to Egypt or to Ethiopia or to Sudan to see the living proof. The writings on the tombs, the writings in the pyramids, what is called the pyramid text and the coffin text. That is providing that they have not seen the holy scriptures of the Africans of the Nile Valley, otherwise called the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or as Budge called it in his translation of the hieratic writing, or the Egyptian book of the coming forth by day and by night. In the temple of Seti-1, for example, at a place called Abydos, not only is there the writings of an immaculate conception 4,000 years before the story of Mary, but it is there in picture form. Are we to say that the theologians of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have never once taken a trip to Egypt, from whence these things were taken? In that same temple, you see a story of how Set-Typhon murdered his brother Osiris 2,000 years before the Jewish story of Cain and Abel. And we are told that an African from Egypt by the name of Moses, born in the city of Goshen, that's still Egypt. Egypt is in Africa, by the way. The last time I saw it in January. You heard of a place called Middle East. I don't know of any place called Middle East. That's political jingoism. But we can find that there was no Moses on Mount Horeb in the Sinai to receive any 10 commandments that had not been given before or written before in Egypt, because you could go in the book of the coming forth by day and by night, the book of the dead, and see in what is called the Osirian drama, not only those 10, but 32 more, a total of 42, which you can also go in the temple of Ramesses VI, in the Valley of the Kings, across what is today called Luxor. And in that tomb, you would see the 42 listed commandments, or otherwise negative confession, 2,000 years before the birth of Moses. But they told you that Moses was taught. He was an Egyptian, taught in school in Egypt, and became a priest in the system. Could you have been born in the United States of America, went to kindergarten, then elementary school, junior high school, and never heard of the United States Constitution? It was equally impossible for Moses to have born in Egypt, go to school in Egypt, study an Egyptian system, worship God Amun-Ra, and never once heard of the 42 negative confession, which have in it, thou shalt not kill, I have not killed man nor woman, I have not made like thy bushel, I have not... Moses himself is charged with murder. His brother Aaron is charged with theft. 40 years before they reached Mount Sinai, then somebody had a law against theft and against murder before he reached Mount Sinai. Where did they get it? But you weren't taught anything about this. All of this information have been suppressed at a place called the Council of Jamia and the Council of Nicene in 325 AD, when Constantine, the Roman emperor, conquered North Africa, took over the role of the Christian church, which started in Alexandria with Pantheus and Boethius, not in Rome. But this too you have not been taught. You have not been taught that the three people who died first in the name of Jesus the Christ were 3 African women: Felicita, Nymphano, and Perpetua. Who told you that the first university built in all of Europe was built by Africans called Moors at the university, what is called the University of Salamanca in Spain? Check it out. Europe's first university. Not only the stones were put together like the stones in most of the building and the bricks in most of the building here. I'm not talking about that aspect of only the building. I'm talking about the educational system is nothing but a copy of the University of Djenne, D-J-E-N-N-E, of ancient Ghana, which was burnt down and rebuilt as the University of Sankore in the city of Tumbat, which the French later called Timbuktu. Then carried, as the Africans called Moors, conquered Iberia, now Spain and Portugal and southern France, and established in there the university system. And as I said before, it was not the first. The earliest of the Greeks were trained in a place called the subordinate lodge of Croton and Delphi. Subordinate lodges of the Grand Lodge in a place called Waset, which the Greeks later changed to Thebes or Thebes. The current Arabs changed it to Luxor. But did you get that in Greek philosophy? Did you get it in Greek history or European history? None whatsoever. And how did you get Hannibal Barca and his father Hasdrubal Barca and his brother and his father, rather, Hamilcar, his brother Hasdrubal? How did you receive it in the educational system? How did the textbook show it? It showed it as they were not Africans. What they said is some Phoenicians came from Phoenicia, and Carthagos, which they later called Carthage, was in fact a Phoenician country. 80 people came from Phoenicia with a woman named Elisa, which Virgil called Dido or Dido in his little play about it. And those 80 changed all the Africans into Phoenicians. And thus we are taught that the Africans of Carthagos were in fact Caucasians. But I accidentally went to Morocco, accidentally, and find that what I had been taught in school was nothing but a pack of lies. Because I then went into the temple, I then went into the museum and found that it was totally different. But then I went on to Italy, in the Medici Museum, the Museum of Alessandro de' Medici, only to find that Alessandro was an African born in Italy. And no one had told me up to then that there were Roman emperors from Africa, such as Honorius and Septimus Severus and his son Caracalla. No one had taken time to explain to me anything about the Greeks coming to Egypt and to Nubia and to Ethiopia, depending on who they were, to receive their earliest education, those who had not gone to a little colony, a little enclave in what was then called Lebus, now called Libya, to receive their first glimpse into education taught by Africans. So in my further examination, I was dealing with 3.14. All of you here in engineering knows what it's supposed to symbolize. They say it's pi. And I was taught that it came from the Greeks. And you know, I believed it. What else could I do? The teacher told me. And then when I went to Ethiopia and to Egypt and to Nubia, in the ancient records of the ancient Africans of the Nile Valley Africans, there was pi being used 2,000 years before there was such a place as Greece. The first writer of Greece that brought Greece into civilization, because they said the demarcation between uncivilized and civilized have to do with the time when you start writing history, they call it, prehistoric and historic. And Homer is the Greek first writer. And Homer said that even the concept of God, Zeus and Apollo, came from Ethiopia. So when you get in the Greek fraternities and sororities, just remember what Homer said. You must have dealt with the Iliad and the Odyssey by now. But again, why
is
understand.
this so?
And I said to the students today at the high school, even the paper you write on shows your heritage and your history. It was in Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan that the first papyrus paper was created, not rice paper in China. Just as it was in Egypt that engineering, Sesostris II, you are engineers, many of you, Sesostris II changed the flow of the Nile. That S-turn you see there was placed there by African engineers in 2250 BC. There was no Jesus yet, no Adam and Eve story yet, because that came out of the Sanhedrin in 700 BC. Just yesterday, when the African engineers was changing the flow of the Nile, hydrographic engineering, there was no Adam, no Eve yet, no Jehovah, because Abraham, the first Jew that brought out the concept of a Jehovah, wasn't even born. The Africans had already worshipped Ptah, P-T-A-H. Amen-Ra. You still say Amen at the end of each prayer, and they told you it means so be it. That's a lie. Amen was the God of the north. God Amen with God Ra, and called Amen-Ra. Thousands of years before there was a Jehovah, Jesus, or Allah. Muhammad ibn Abdullah wasn't born until 570 of the Christian era. Pontius and Boetius that started Christianity wasn't born until 50 AD. According to the story. And Abraham, who started the concept of a God named Jehovah and Adam and Eve's story, wasn't born until 1760 BC. The Africans of Egypt and Ethiopia and Nubia were already in their 13th dynastic period. No different than the lie they told us that the Jews built the pyramids. Which one? The little one in their bathtub? There are 72 pyramids throughout Egypt. The first one was designed, engineered, and built by the multi-genius, first one known in the world, Imhotep. That was the third dynasty. The last one was the sixth dynasty, and the first Jew wasn't born until the 13th dynasty. You can't see, they know that when the Africans were built, made their first calendar in 10,000 BC, 10,000 BC, called the stellar calendar, and revised that in 4100 BC, the so-called pre-dynastic era. Where was Greece? Where was Etrusca, that later became Rome? They don't tell you about this, do they? They don't tell you anything about this aspect of the African, because it's not slavery. It doesn't deal with Amos and Andy. It doesn't deal with roots and novel, which they got you to believe had something to do with your history. They couldn't do this because they did not. Where were they when you were dealing with astronomy? That's the movement of the stars and the other planets related thereto. Imhotep and astrology established the pyramid text and the Khafre text. When you go to a place called Aswan and you see how the Africans, your ancestors, dug those marble obelisks. And when you go, you always, they tell you in school, and they read the beautiful love story about the Majahara who built his palace for his most beloved wife, the Taj Mahal. They didn't stop to tell you that thousands of years before that, a pharaoh by the name of Ramesses II not only built a temple out of hewn rock bigger than this place, along with one for his most beautiful and most precious wife, Nefertara. Don't mix her up with Nefertiti. Nefertiti was the wife of Amenhotep IV, who changed his name to Akhenaten. That's the 18th dynasty. I am talking about Nefertara, the wife of Ramesses II. That is the 19th dynasty. No mention about that, because they can't tell you African men did anything good for African women, much less to mention pharaohs and queens. Yet the evidence is still there. You go to Ethiopia at a place called Lalibela, and you see the rock-hewn temples, the rock-hewn churches in the side of mountain, down in the ground, engineering thousands of years before any country existed in all of Europe. I'm not to speak about it. All I say to you is check me out. Check these things out for yourself. Go and see them, read about them, research about them. So when why? What happened? You say, why do I need to know it? If Dr. Martin Luther King knew what I'm talking about, he would not have gone to Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi to learn about nonviolence. He would have known that Gandhi read the works of Akhenaten to learn about, and he would have gone home to his native Africa to get first-hand information. They didn't tell him about Akhenaten because, you see, they don't talk about Akhenaten because Akhenaten taught about monotheism. He died before Moses was born, preaching monotheism, the worship of the god Aten, A-T-E-N. He taught about the Trinity of God, and you could go at a temple called the Temple of Luxor and see on the wall the Trinitarian concept 3,000 years before Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. But they couldn't teach Akhenaten. They couldn't teach these things, because then you would question what is being taught to you now in theosophy, in theology. Swastika was originally called the Gramadon, G-R-A-M-A-D-O-N. You will see Gramadons at the bottom sole of Buddha in Buddhist temples. You will see it in South America used with respect to Coatepalca, the crucified god of the Mexicans, at the time when Mexico was called Azteca. You would also see it all over Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. It goes back to about 1400 BC in the Nile Valley, and it was used as a symbol of peace. What Hitler did was to adopt it. The Germans under Kaiser Wilhelm and Otto von Bismarck captured what was then Togo. At a time when the other European powers and Great Britain, with the help of the United States, was conquering all of Africa, from 1830, when France invaded Ceuta, to 1884, when they took almost all of the lands on the coast and gave Congo to Leopold II. It was then, when Germany was fighting France for Alsace-Lorraine, that the Germans realized that they weren't getting part of the action, went into Togo, took over Togo, and it is then that they adopted the eagle, the iron eagle, by the patron saint of Germany, an African by the name of Maurice, which they call Maurice of Aragon, along with the symbol that Maurice used as the bishop. You would notice if you go to the Museum of natural history in New York, you would see a Togolese garment from the 14th century with the Gramadon and the Iron Cross and the eagle, which the German adopted from their colonial underlings, the Togolese, and that's where it came from. The educational system of the Nile Valley, centered at the Grand Lodge of Wasset, which is now called Luxor by the Arabs, is that every discipline, a child went in at age 7, a young boy, and he was not completed with education until age 47. He never left. It took 40 years to train an educated man who left with the title priest. So within that 40 years, he learned everything there was. And as such, he even influenced the Pharaoh because he decided most of the things the Pharaoh had to do. Thus, engineering, law, medicine, science, mathematics, everything was done and taught in the mystery system. And those students coming out of the mystery system were sent around the nation to be the teachers. So the mystery system was the educational system of the entire Nile Valley. Not only Egypt. Egypt became the zenith of what took place, the high cultures along the Nile. And so that's how the mystery system. Now, in order, like any society, there are a group of elite within the educational system. And they became the elite. Thus, it was necessary for them to have, quote unquote, passwords and so forth, to maintain secrets amongst each other, because education, believe it or not, is not for the masses.
come the movement, even when the Egyptians are defeated, their ideas and sciences enter Europe. And then come other movements. We found Taharqa, the Sudanese pharaoh. When I was reading about the Mohammedan dynasties, I found to my astonishment that in the Spanish history it was mentioned how a black pharaoh, Taharqa they called him, who was both a head of the army and later became a king of Egypt and Nubia, how he came in with a garrison into Spain. And they found cartouches, the signature of some of these kings, from the Shishongs to the Osorkans, that are found in Spain, and some Egyptian influences in some Spanish villages. And then came Hannibal. That's another invasion. Hannibal, and for a long time, although there are many books on Hannibal, they just said, well, he couldn't possibly be African. But I want to draw your attention to a very important essay in that book, Great Black Leaders. There's an essay on Hannibal that is very important, and there you will see for the first time the actual photograph of Hannibal as found in a coin. Now, there are many of these coins, okay, and all of them have Africoid faces on them, but this one is a special one. This is clearly Hannibal, because on the other side of the coin is the elephant Surus. This is the elephant, the only elephant that Hannibal rode. And there's an inscription telling you it is Surus. And all the battles that were involved, bringing the Africans and other people, mercenary armies across the Alps, and the final battle against the Romans is all described in that essay. For 10 years, Hannibal held power over a great part of Europe. But when his brother Hasdrubal tried to bring up reinforcements from Africa, he was murdered, and the Carthaginians lost hope, and Hannibal was abandoned, and he committed suicide. But very significant was the eventual movement in Europe by the Moors, and I want to say a lot about the Moors. The Moors, that there again greatly misunderstood who were the Moors. A mix of people. In the Sahara, there were people known as the Garamantes. These are indigenous black people. However, there came in some fair-skinned Libyans. They're both black Libyans and fair-skinned Libyans. These people came in, and they were known as the Tawny Moors. Okay, the white Moors or the Tawny Moors, but the vast majority were black Moors, the Garamantes. Then, at first, the Arabian Peninsula was peopled strictly by blacks. Then came another group coming in, and by the time of Muhammad, the blacks were a minority in Arabia. So you have an Arabian type that comes into play. You have two types in Arabia, both a dark-skinned type and a fair-skinned type, in the time of Muhammad. And in fact, it is the fair-skinned type that runs against Muhammad and pushes him into Ethiopia. Muhammad runs into Ethiopia, just as Jesus went to Egypt. Both prophets go into the fastnesses of Africa when they were in trouble. And you find Muhammad retreated into Ethiopia, he and his disciples, and eventually charged back again and conquered his enemies. After his death, the ideas that inspired him were to spread over the world. It was to spread over the world because many of the Mohammedans or Muslims came into various parts of the world and tried to convert people. They went into India, they attacked India. They went even as far up as into China. They went into Africa. They intermarried with Africans. And eventually, the major part of the story occurs around 711 AD, when an African general, Tariq, is sent out across the Straits of Gibraltar with 7,000 troops. 6,700 of them are black Africans, 300 are other types. Probably fair-skinned Arabian types. I use the word Arabian versus the word Arab because anyone can be an Arab. Anyone speaking Arabic. They move up into Spain, they conquer Spain. Now, if you go to Spain, you're going to find the same problem that you find with the Egyptians. They don't want to hear anything about the Moors. They don't want to hear anything about the Moors. Because the Moors, as far as they were concerned, they don't seem to understand. They don't want to go and check out what actually these guys brought into them. They don't want to hear anything about it. Yet all of our pictures of these Moors are drawn by the Spanish, because the Muslims forbade the creation of images. So when there's the surrender of the Moors, it's drawn by the Spanish. Black generals surrendering. Now, if they weren't in charge and they were not the Moors, how are they surrendering? It's like if the Russians come here and we're supposed to surrender. Who do you think is going to do the surrendering? Could we surrender this country to them? I mean, it's so absurd. I mean, when you see these black faces, it's amazing. It's like this book I read when I was studying the Moors. I read this book by this English woman. A big book. For 300 pages, the Moors are fair-skinned with straight noses and blue eyes. Then things go bad and the Moors are being pushed back. And one says there's a big battle, and then you suddenly the sentence, tremendous slaughter of the Africans. Where the hell did they come from? I mean, with not a pause, no flutter of the eyelid. Now the thing is going down. Everybody is black. You find it in England too. You find it when you go into the museums. As soon as they reach the point where the Sudanese pharaoh, they have period of decline. Period of decline. Okay, it's going to the dogs. It's going to the blacks. And there is no, I mean, I'm telling you, this thing has become so, it's become a reflex. They don't even realize there's anything. I cannot imagine what an impact the Moors had on Europe. Greece and Rome, their glory had long faded. Europe had fallen into a great sleep. Europe was so backward that a disease had struck and killed half the people. It was worse than AIDS. They had no protection. Public baths were unknown in Europe. Disease spread like flies. It was unbelievable, the low level of Europe. There was not a lighted street in Europe. There was not a paved street in Europe. The kings in Europe lived in barns. Then came the Muslims. They set up these fantastic mosques. Unbelievable things. If you see them, some of them today, they're absolutely unbelievable. They introduced public baths, unknown in Europe. Public baths. They introduced public libraries. There were private libraries in Europe for the elite who read and wrote, the few who read and wrote. There were no public libraries for the people. Europe had 2 universities. The Muslims introduced 17 universities into Europe. Everything that could be found in the outer world, everything that could be brought in where the Moors had their courts in Morocco and in Europe was brought into the universities. Everything was translated into Arabic, which, by the way, was invented by Abul Aswan, an African. It's in the diaries of Ibn Khalikan, because that script was created at the time when Arabia was largely black. It was not largely black at the time of Muhammad. And there were major figures in the Muslim. The right-hand man of Muhammad was a black man, Bilal. Some people claim Muhammad was black. Arabs, they are to respect blacks. They are to treat them as equals. He also said the same thing about women. He wouldn't say that some of his family he didn't have family in his extended family who were black, but his right-hand man, Bilal, was black. And many of the major figures at this time are black figures. That thrust into Europe brought 4 dynasties, and the last 2 dynasties were actually created on the Senegal River. The Almoravid and the Almohade dynasty, those were overwhelmingly African dynasties. The first dynasty, the Umayyad dynasty, had major African elements. The Abbasid dynasty didn't last at all. It lasted 6 years when the fights which have been going on up to the day, the Sunnis and the Shiites practically killing each other. After the Umayyads established a dynasty, the Africans and Arabs established a dynasty. The royal family was holidaying in Damascus, and the Shiites killed 76 members of the royal family and seized power. And then the Umayyads retreated, Abdurrahman retreated back into Africa, brought a great African force back and smashed the Abbasids' renewed power. And he insisted that everybody should live in harmony, that they should not take spite against that Christian, Jews, and Moors should have equal rights. He also insisted that one thing he did insist, he did not, and this is one thing people say, well, okay, but you invaded Europe too, so what are you talking about us invading you? Well, we, the Moors, of which we are a critical part, did not destroy the legal system of Spain and Portugal, did not destroy their churches, did not destroy their language, did not destroy their humanity. So that is not the same thing. Invasion is something everybody expands and invades, but it's not natural to treat people like dogs, like chattel. That was very special. Even in the Romans, when they had slaves, they had laws governing the slaves, far more sophisticated than the laws governing Negroes, quote unquote. So it's not the same thing. That claim cannot be made. That cannot be thrown in our faces. And look, the things they brought in, everything that could be translated. Out of China they brought gunpowder. Out of India they brought the numbers. Europe did not have numbers. It had a number system, but it did not have ciphers. The Romans, more advanced even than the Greeks, had letters for numbers. 1 is 1, 2 is 1, 1, 3 is 1, 1, 1, 4 is 1 V. V is a letter. 5 is V. 6 is V1, 7 V11, 8 V111. That's how they counted, laboriously. The early Africans, the Egyptians, had ciphers. Greece did not. Rome did not. And who do you think brought the ciphers we're using today into Europe? Not Europeans. Europeans didn't invent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Some people claim it came out of India. And recently, about a year ago, someone brought to my attention that at Saqqara, there's a stone in the step pyramid of Saqqara which carries the shape of these numbers, and that Imhotep, at the time of Imhotep, these ciphers are listed alongside of the common ciphers. But we have no dead proof of that. I have sent that around to 6 black mathematicians and no one has yet replied. It is possible one day we will be able to solve it, but one thing is quite clear, it is not European. So comes things from all over the world, the compass, the astrolabe, the ciphers, the calendar, all of these things coming from, and then you're going to hear about how we did it all. We made the world. You see, these are the little people who were backward and did not have a brain like ours, did not have as many convolutions in their brain. Even scripts, which we take for granted, how Europe became so literate. Europe was 99% illiterate the time the Moors attacked in 711 AD. So was the rest of the world. Small cliques everywhere read and wrote. The large amount of people did not. But it was the Muslims who made education important. They made it necessary at a certain level you had to have education. And guess what they introduced? The Africans and Arabs coming out of Morocco and other parts of Africa and Arabia brought into Europe a whole lot of things. Air conditioning for the first time. Bringing water underground pipes bringing water from the mountains. For the first time, baths, public baths for the first time. And bringing so many things, all the great fruits of the world, strawberries and lemons and dates and all of those things introduced into Europe for the first time. The silk industry introduced to Europe for the first time. The rice industry introduced into Europe for the first time. And all the things like us today, for example, in sophisticated Japan, the best cameras, the best radios, the best cars, etc. It's so frightening that at that time, the best things in the world were where the blacks and the Arabs were. The tanneries of Morocco, the sashes of Almeria, the carpets of Tulala, the steel of Damascus, all where the Moors had their centers, that is where the best things were. They introduced optics. The first eyeglasses in the world were made by the Moors. The first experiments with the camera, although it was not yet perfected, was made by the Moors. And we never hear anything about that. They wrote long agricultural treatises. All these things were introduced. The first lighted streets in Europe, the first paved streets in Europe were made by the Moors. And all this in 1492 came to a brutal end. It came to an end before. It came to an end around 1230 AD when the Moors started to retreat until they were left with one place, Granada. And in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed for the Caribbean, came the forces of the Spanish, defeating the rest of the Moors who had been split by battles between the Sunnis and the Shiites. They were weakened. The slave trade had weakened, had already begun to affect other parts of Africa. And then eventually you find the fall of the Moors in 1492. And that fall was a tremendous fall because it was to change so many things. And the most important thing it was to change was the attitude of the world towards people of African descent. Because there was a deliberate attempt to destroy everything, to destroy even the memory of that time. In 1492, Cardinal Ximenes ordered everything to be burnt that was Arabic. 84,000 manuscripts at the time when the printing press had not been invented, and when a manuscript, there could be no more than 2 or 3 of a manuscript, all that was burnt. Deliberate destruction, just as in America, there were 3 massive burnings of books. And so we look back to that period and people could come and tell us, but what did you do? What did Europe do? As I said to Congress on July the 7th of last year, these ships of Columbus, not one instrument in those ships was European. The sails were Arab Latin sails, which Arabs and Africans were using on other oceans. The compass did not come out of Europe. The astrolabe did not come out of Europe. They did not even know how to plot latitude and longitude. Columbus struck out for the latitude of Japan, hoping to land in India. And he himself says it. He says, I have 8 or 9 pilots aboard the ships, and they are like blind men. My pilots are so ignorant, I am afraid that they will not find again the lands I have discovered. Unquote. This is Columbus himself, talking very honestly about the level, the sophisticated technological level they had reached. And their ships, those were no big ships, were vast ships that were put on the ocean. The Chinese report ships from Africa 2 centuries before Columbus coming with elephants. Can't take elephants to China in a dugout. And as I said, and it's very important that among the tapes that you should get a copy of the tape on Van Sertima before Congress, because then you hear the whole story. You hear all the voices in the chamber, etc., because I did embarrass them. Because the chairman The chairman of the Overseas Congressional Committee, which is looking at the work of the Christopher Columbus Quincentenary Commission, and they're going to have this big hullabaloo in 1992. But they're not going to get away scot-free, because we're going to have our hullabaloo in 1992 as well. But they asked them, do you have any blacks on your commission? No. Any Native Americans? No. So how could it be an American celebration? Who are you celebrating? So now let me close, because I have to show the slides and we're running out of time. I've been in another state yesterday and the day before, and I'm in another state tomorrow, and I'm marking papers and going into my classes, so I'm really rather tired. But I want to close by saying that the story of the African presence in Europe is one of the most unusual stories. It is very, very central and pivotal, and it is central and pivotal because of the fact that Europe has dominated us for the last 5 centuries and has brought us to a point where, even though we've gone beyond slavery, naked, brutal slavery, there is a slave master walking about in our heads. We have become our own slave masters. We have that policeman walking about in our heads. And we have a situation now where, even though the facts are coming out, it's as if there's a resurrection of facts. We are still in that state of death, that state of sleep, in which we have been for centuries. And let us therefore remember, this is the one thing that struck me tremendously, was that towards the beginning of this century, there was a town in the West Indies. I can't remember where at the moment, but there was a volcanic explosion. And only one man survived. He was a prisoner. He survived, Montpellier, thank you. He survived because he was slightly on the ground. He survived because he was half away from the disaster on the surface. That is the black. And that is the message of this century. That when the volcano erupts, that blows away this crust of lies, let it be that whatever else happens, that magic, that beauty, that power that exists within us, imprisoned though it is now, will be the thing that will survive. Thank you very much. There are many sculptures found in the caves of Europe about 55,000 years ago. This is one of them, which deals with a certain kind of figure with very high hips and very big buttocks, and a certain structure of face, etc., which is found all over Europe in that time and in parts of southern Africa. This is going back, of course, about 55,000 years ago. Next. But coming now to deal with marks left by Africans in the civilizations of Europe. It seemed that not all the blacks disappeared. This is a black in Britain. This, you see the crown. This is in the royal annals of early Britain. When Britain was attacked by the Romans, it was recorded that in some places the people were black as Ethiopians, and they could not understand that. So that in certain parts of Europe, the black figure did not entirely disappear in the population. You have, for example, in some instances, like in Ireland, you have a battle between Black Sea rovers, the Fomorians with the Furburgs, and therefore, and you have the capture of Tory Island, a big section of Ireland, by Africans. Okay, this is in Britain next. There you find, this is in the Royal Annals of Britain, the figure with the peculiar hair, very unlike the Anglo-Saxon hair, with features, etc., and crowns, etc. Next. This is a black knight being married to an Anglo-Saxon lady. This is also from British history. Next. This is in northern Europe now. This is among the Vikings. Next. This is one of the Danish warriors. Next. This is the Swedish warrior. I should mention that they found very tall, powerful blacks among the Vikings. The Vikings are white, but you have major black figures among the Vikings. Thorstein the Hunter and Thorhall. These are powerful black figures that appear among the Vikings. And Gormund, the king of Ireland, one of the kings of Ireland, was black. Next. This is in Crete now, which had a profound influence, Minoan Crete, which had a profound influence on Greece, apart from Egypt, and Schliemann and Evans, who excavated Crete, came to the conclusion that this was an African civilization, or largely African civilization. Here you see this goes back more than 3,000 years. You could see the drawings of blacks. Next. This is the war party. This is the navigation scene. Once again, look at the ships. This is more than 3,000 years ago. Look at the curve of the ships. Look, the people who are in the vessels, not just the rowers, but in the main vessel where the chief is. These are all blacks. Next. This is the stag hunt with the blacks again. Next. This is the army captain of the Cretans, black. Next. This is a priest, Pylos, in Crete, black. This is to have a profound influence on Greek civilization, not just the Egyptian. Next. This is the god Bes with African type features. Next. This is Isis and suckling Horus. This was to be the prototype of the Black Madonna, which was to be found all across Europe. Even the Roman Emperor Caligula, that lunatic, had a shrine to Isis. Next. This is Isis again, arms outstretched. Next. This is the Black Diana. This is found in Europe. Next. Here again you see the Black Madonna. Faces changing now, where the face is becoming a little more European, but the black thing is retained. Next. And the idea. Here one very striking. This is in Spain. This is the Black Madonna and Child. These served as images of Mary and Jesus for many centuries until the time of Michelangelo. Next. This is the Black Pope, Pope Miltiades. This is a portrait done more than 1,000 years ago. It's been removed from the church. The Vatican probably has it, the original. This is 311 to 314 AD. This is the time during which Constantine was converted. Next. There are 25 saints in the Roman Church which are black. This is one of the most famous, Saint Maurice. This was the patron saint of Germany and Austria until the time of Hitler, when he was removed. Next. Here is Saint Maurice, very famous saint of the Roman Catholic Church. Next. This is Saint Benedict the Moor. Next. These are now one or two blacks who became very famous and boasted about their black blood, mixed blood. Alexander Dumas and Alexander Dumas Père became a very famous swordsman and lover and writer in France. Next. This is a black community found in Russia. Russians do not understand how they got there. Okay, that was found about 50 years ago. Next. This is the boy who was adopted by the Russians, the Tsar of Russia, Peter the Great, who adopted a black boy and kept him in his court. He came to be known as Petrovich Hannibal. It's not to be confused with Hannibal the warrior. This is Petrovich Hannibal. He was made general-in-chief of some of the Russian forces, He was also appointed head of the International Commission by the Russians to negotiate a treaty between Sweden and Russia, a border dispute between Sweden and Russia. He also was an engineer. He was tutor in mathematics to the Crown Prince of Russia, and also he was responsible for a major section of Russia because Tsarina Elizabeth put him in charge of a great section of the peasantry. So he was greatly respected. He is the maternal grandfather of Pushkin. Next. This is Pushkin, who boasted about his black ancestry. He became the most famous poet in Russia. He transformed. The reason why he became so important is because he started to write for the people. The Russian language was only used by as a literary language. The Russian language is used by many people, but as a literary language, it was not used a lot. French was used. It was disrespected by a lot of the Russians until Pushkin wrote, and Pushkin made the language come alive, so that he became very famous. He, however, started to write for the people, causing disturbances, so that the Tsar threatened him. He persisted, and he was banished. And then they felt sorry for him, and he was brought back from banishment. But after that, he was told not to write again, and he became a playboy and started running about the place with a lot of women. Eventually, he married a woman who had a love affair with a Russian officer, and Pushkin challenged him to a duel, and he was stabbed in the stomach, and he died. But the Russians were so afraid because of his popularity that students were forbidden to cut classes on the day that Pushkin died. But for many days afterwards, thousands of Russians filed past his bier. Next. Here's the Black Venus. Next. There was a great fascination with the black woman, so many of the painters drew naked black women, and black women became to represent the most sensual woman in the world, and as a result of that, many of the noblemen and kings desired black women, and there were lots of affairs between kings and black women. This is particularly true of the French kings and the Portuguese kings. It's also true of the Italian noblemen. You find, for example, the Medici as well as the Gonzagas, the two most powerful and richest families in Europe. They both had black women, and as a result of this, you have the next slide. You have the Duke of Florence. He was the son of a pope, the liaison between a pope, Pope Clement VIII, who was Cardinal de' Medici, and his mistress, producing the Duke of Florence, who was put in charge of a great part of Italy. Next. This is the Black Nun of Moray. This is a result of a liaison between Queen Therese of France and a black man in her court called Nabo. She had been very jealous because her husband, Louis XIV, was having an affair with a black woman, and to spite him, she had an affair with Nabo in court. And when this black child was born, the King of France said to his doctors, "How could I give birth to a black child?" The doctor said, "You see that black man in your court, Nabo? It is possible that while your wife was pregnant, he looked at her, and the child turned black." And the king said, "It must have been a very penetrating look." Anyway, this led to scandal, and she was smuggled into a monastery where they visited her for the rest of her life. They did not allow her to live in the palace. The Duke of Chartres fell in love with her, but could not get permission from King Louis XIV to marry her. So she was taken back to the monastery where she died. She's known as the Black Nun of Moray. Next. These are figures from the coins. Unfortunately, we haven't yet got, except in the book Great Black Leaders, we haven't got the coin of Hannibal. But these are figures who served in the great Carthaginian army under Hannibal when they defeated the Romans. Next. Next. This shows you the centers in Africa during the Middle Ages where learning began. It's not like the North Africa of today, which has been overwhelmed by a certain type. This was very, very indigenously African, as they say, the Garamantes, indigenous black Africans, and people coming in from Arabia to try and bring about the Muslim conversion. Next. This is one of the chiefs of one of the Moorish sections of the army. Next. Bearers of the veil. This is from the Senegal River. Next. This was the Prime Minister of Sicily, because the Moors did not just enter Spain and Portugal, they also entered Sicily. This is Joan Maurus, who was the Prime Minister of Sicily. Next. This is, you can see clearly now here the enemy representing these types, so you can see very clearly their faces. This is in the heart of Europe. This is in the heart of Europe now. This is about the 10th century, more than 1,000 years ago, blacks coming through Europe. He's clearing the way as the black dignitaries enter into the street. Next. We have a problem there. We've gone back instead of forward. Yeah, okay. Now this is the circumcision ritual, again held in the heart of Spain, where the blacks are having a big festival in the heart of their dominions in Spain. Next. These are black noblemen playing chess in 12th century Spain. Here they are. Okay. Next. This is a black in Morocco. This is probably a painting, but this is more recent. Next. Now this is a very important document. Many Europeans had taken for granted after the slave trade that Africa was an empty wilderness, that they didn't have any great cities, etc. Leo Africanus wrote a book on the geography and history of Africa, a very famous book. Only a few people read it because not many people read it at that time. But he drew maps showing how deeply studied with towns and cities was Africa before it broke up. It's a very important document. The man who read this book is Shakespeare. Shakespeare was extremely liberal for his time. Shakespeare, in fact, had a great love woman called Lucy Negro of Clerkenwell, to whom he wrote an ode. Shakespeare also read very closely about Africa from Leo Africanus, and actual sentences from Leo Africanus appear in Shakespeare's Othello, describing the nobility of many of the blacks in this area. Now, the story of Othello came from an actual happening, and here I want to close by showing you the people who were involved in that happening. Next. This is a white man, an Italian, a nobleman, very rich nobleman, the Gonzaga, from the Gonzaga's family. Okay, next. This is the black woman he married. This is in the ceilings of his palace. This is his daughter. Next. And this is his son. This is Othello. He married a white woman whom he murdered on Christmas Day because he suspected she was having an affair with a lover. And a novel was written about it by a man called Cincio. And it is that novel that came into Shakespeare's hands, and Shakespeare wrote the story of Othello. Okay. Next. That's it for tonight, folks. To realize that Africa is an exploded star, a shattered diamond, and that its pieces have to be followed in all the continents. You cannot have a sense of what was essentially African just by going into Africa. You have to look into Europe, into Asia, into America. I have been associated for a long time with the American thesis, the establishment of an African presence in early America. But that is just a part, is just one part of the whole story. What we are trying to achieve is a synthesis of the African presence all over the world. The African presence in Europe, which I'm dealing with tonight, is tremendously important, just as important as the African presence in early America, because it really begins at the very beginning. Because there are no Europeans on this planet until about 55 to 50,000 years ago, whereas there are Africans going back 3 million years. Modern man only goes back about 140,000. Some people put it at 200,000. What has also been established by Rebecca Cann is that all the creatures now on this planet can be traced to one black woman who lived about 150,000 years ago. They have been able to do this with great precision because the instruments we have now, the way we can go into the blood and find out the history of man, we know that only the black has all the genes. So they can find out at what point you have these variations and mutations. Dealing with the little breakthroughs Africans made in their own continent. They didn't think that I would deal with Europe and show the profound influence of Africa and Europe, because they want to keep that very pure. That is what this whole story is about. We have become the invisible man of history. Everybody else is visible and significant. We do not exist. We move like fleeting shadows over the continents of the world, and we seem to have left no mark. We're the only people who seem to have just moved through and left no mark. How could that be possible? We who fathered it all. And I'm not saying we fathered all the sciences. That is a hollow boast. But we who fathered man. How could we have passed over the whole world for all those many, many centuries and generations without having left a mark? How well has this been hidden? Because apart from the question of Grimaldi man given to Cro-Magnon man, the so-called Caucasoid type, a culture that Europe did not have. At the very beginning, the tools and weapons, even some early musical instruments were left in Europe. Art too. A certain kind of art where you could look on the caves of Europe at a certain period and find that the women are identical with the women in southern Africa because Europeans had not yet appeared. I mean, what we call the European today. But let us look at civilization now. Let us look closely at the record of the impact of Africa and its presences in Europe. Now, physical presences in itself is not enough, and you can see quite clearly where that could lead. Have in Europe. Merely being there doesn't make us anything. What impact did we have? We had a profound impact. When the Europeans first attacked Africa, and I'm not talking about the latest slave trade period, when the great Europeans, which were then the Greeks, who came much later, who got their thing together much later than the Egyptians, when they walked into Africa and walked into Egypt, they were absolutely stunned. Egypt is not something that you could say, oh, but it happened in Egypt. Like some isolate. It wasn't an isolate. Egypt was the flower of Africa. There were all sorts of strands and threads moving over many, many centuries. We have found some of the hieroglyphs now in West Africa. We have found ritual practices among the Yoruba and the Dogon, which are Egyptian. Not because the Egyptians brought it, but because it was there before it went up to the Egyptians. In other words, Egypt was a child of Africa. It's not the father, it was the child. That is why the word Africa actually comes from Afro-Ika, an Egyptian word that means birthplace. They look back to the south. Even the word for south, Kenti, it doesn't just mean the south, it means the first. It means the beginning also. They look back to Africa, back to the heartland, the continental heartland, as the source of their ritual, the source of their concepts of religion, the source of their techno-complex or science, the source of their main ideas. And what we found in 1962 is very important. We found a pharaonic dynasty, first in Nubia, which is indisputably African. It is first found there in the dawn, not in the evening, in the dawn. And as Bruce Williams has shown, who was one of the discoverers, you have this pharaonic impulse running through the Nubians, even at times when they are oppressed by their brothers and cousins, and that's not unusual. You don't think that because one people oppress another, they're of different races. You see that in Vietnam. There was wars between the North and South. It's the same people. You see that even in America, the civil war between the North and the South, it's the same people fighting. So that you're not to assume that because there were wars between Egypt and Nubia, or there are periods in which Egypt suppressed Nubia, that they're different people. That has nothing to do with race. All the arguments, when you look at the plant life of the Egyptians, the bottle gourd, cultivated cotton, the tamarind, the oil palm fruit, a range of things, you could trace a whole lot of things. All the plant life is African, it is Sudanic. Now if Egypt had been created by Asiatics or Europeans, where are their plants? In that early period, where are their plants? The language which was in question for so long has been established by Diop through thousands of interconnections to be an African language. The iconography, you go back to those early kings, the Narmer, the first king of Egypt. You go back to people in the 11th and 12th dynasties. You go back to the people in the first great kingdoms. The faces are clearly African, not like the people in Egypt today. Those are not Egyptians. Okay, you have to make those distinctions. There are some Africans in Egypt, but Arab is not an African. There are some Arabs who are African because Arab is not a race. But the Arab Republic of Egypt is not an African republic. Make that quite clear, because when Diop was fighting in UNESCO, the people who hurt him most and who objected most to being called black were the Egyptians, because they had nothing to do with it. The Arabs came into Egypt in 638 AD. That is thousands of years after Egyptian civilization. They had nothing to do with it. That Arab, the Arabian type that is, had nothing to do with establishing Egyptian civilization. It's just like America. There are no Native Americans in this room. And if you go into other white institutions, there are no Native Americans. There are modern people who have migrated to this country, whether by force, as most of us have, or by invading the country. Likewise in Egypt, its culture has been changed. It's speaking another language. When you go and you look at those incredible monuments, they have nothing to do with the people walking around there. They don't even know what it means. They don't even know how to deal with it. My wife and I were in Egypt this summer, and we were photographing the wigs because we discovered that the two major clues to establish the blackness of the early Egyptians is skin and hair. Skin, lucky, because they're the only people who preserved their skin. Europeans didn't. They didn't know how. Africans preserved bodies for thousands of years. We have a picture of an African princess, 3,000 years old. Her skin looks like if she was buried yesterday. The hair, the eye, the pupil of the eyes, the skin, the teeth. Can you imagine that? Some people lose their teeth by the time they're dead. She has her teeth 3,000 years later. We're not dealing with ordinary people. This was the period in the world when blacks had a chance to sit down and do some thinking. They had overpowered certain territories and they could control their destiny. They were not slaves of anyone. And they had a chance to do their science. And it's not an accident. They were far ahead of the rest of the world in astronomy, in mathematics, in mummification, in brain surgery, in a range of medical things. It's not miracles. They were involved in their science for a long time while other people were struggling. The European had not caught up with that. So that when the first European entered Africa and touched Egypt, when the Greek touched the Egyptians, they did not treat them with contempt. I want you to note that it's not automatic about white and black being enemies. The whites were stunned by the achievements of the blacks. And they were not only stunned, they stood in awe. So that even though they had defeated the armies which had been taxed by battles with the Asiatics and battles with all sorts of people, the Persians and so forth, when they came in and they overpowered them, they bowed down before their god. They took the black man Imhotep and worshipped him as a god. Many black women became goddesses for the whites. Isis, who was the goddess, who was the female representation of God, she was worshipped throughout Europe, a black woman. They didn't think any woman of their race had that nobility. Artemis became the goddess of chastity. Minerva became the goddess of wisdom. These are black women. Circe in the Odyssey, a black woman. Andromeda, who helped Jason win the Golden Fleece, who married Perseus, the great Greek hero. That's a black woman. It's whitewashed afterwards on the vases, but you could see in the black women in the antiquity book, you could see what it looked like originally. And Isis became the prototype of all the great Madonnas of Europe. And even when they were broken, some of them were remade with European faces, but with the black ritual color. So it went right through. Everything was affected. They couldn't understand how the Egyptians had written such advanced medical texts. You know, the Egyptians had already done a major work on the pulse. You know, the Greeks, the Europeans, only came to terms with that advance in the pulse 1,000 years later. Egyptians had books, diagnostic percussion, studies of circulation, studies of the pulse. They had chapters that were taken by the Europeans, the Greeks, and copied word for word. Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, the Greek, copied studies and fractures of the clavicle and dislocation of the mandible. Copied word for word. The medical school of Kos in Europe, in Greece, was an imitation of the medical schools in Egypt. Every scholar, St. Clement of Alexandria, said that if you were to write a book of 1,000 pages, it would not be enough to put the names of Greek scholars who went to study in Africa. That was the big thing, as today in shattered Africa, Africans have to go to Europe to study. In those days, Europeans flocked to Africa to study because there was nothing much to study in Europe. Their astronomy was transformed by the Africans. They did not know how to shape the year. They had primitive, inadequate calendars. Egypt gave us the world's first accurate calendar, the 365 and a quarter day year. But of course they observed the quarter differently. They observed it at the end of 1,460 years. They had a leap year. We no longer have a leap year. We call it a leap year, but we don't have it. They did. We only have a leap day. And they split the year. After they dealt with the quarter that way, they were left with 365 days. They had 5 festival days. They created Christmas, not Europe. It's Africa created Christmas. Egypt. The word Christ is an African word, K-R-S-T, Christo, Christ. Then it was translated into Greek, Christos. It's not European. Europeans did not embrace Christ. That was to come much later. When Jesus was being crucified, it's white soldiers, Romans, who were putting the spear in him, who was putting him up on the cross because the Jews thought he should die because he had outraged the Jewish high priest by doing things and saying things that they found ridiculous. Moses had told them an eye for an eye, a tooth for tooth. Jesus said, not only should you forgive your brother 7 times, but 70 times 7. Jesus had the audacity to pick up a whip and chase people out of the temple, which they considered to be a violent act. There were many things that led to that man being killed because he carried ideas, many of which you can find among the Essenes in Egypt. There are several books written by Jews that make Christ out to be an Essene. He was profoundly affected by the Egyptians because he spent his boyhood in Egypt. He was smuggled into a village called Marathia near Heliopolis. He spent his boyhood in Egypt. When you first see him in the Bible, when you first see him in the books by his disciples, they're first aware of him at the age of 12 when he's talking to the doctors. Egyptian doctors, what doctors do you think they are? And then he disappears. People put him all over the place, but we don't know for sure what he did before he went back. But it is said in the Bible, in Hosea, out of Egypt shall I call my son. He goes back now out of Egypt back into Palestine to conduct his ministry. Now many of us have become disillusioned with Christianity because we mix up the baby with the bath water. We think that because Christians have behaved in the most abominable manner as they have, that has anything to do with Jesus the Christ, or it has to do with the essential Christianity. Because some Muslims behave abominably, that has to do with Muhammad. It has nothing to do with that. Once you embrace a religion, whether it be a political ideology or some sort of religious ideology, it's up to you. If you're narrow, you're going to kill people in the name of it. It has nothing to do with the essential golden strand in the religion or in the ideology. There's a far cry between Stalin and Gorbachev. It's the same communism they're talking about. There's a far cry between Muhammad and some of these people who call themselves Muslims. There's a far cry between Jesus the Christ and some of these people who call themselves Christians, who in the name of Jesus practically enslaved half the world. What's Christian about Europe? Everything they did to Africans and people of African descent was un-Christian. It is true that the image of Christ, that marvelous individual who could make his light shine, the individual beauty and power that could make his light shine against the overpowering darkness of the world, that was something that was to bring tremendous inspiration later on to many Europeans. But note, even at the time of the conversion, who do you think was the Pope? When Constantine, the Roman emperor, was converted, the Pope was a black man. You will see his picture in the slides. Miltiades, the black Pope of Rome. Or rather the black Christian Pope, because Rome later became the seat of the papacy. But the black Pope was a black man, Miltiades, 312 to 314 AD. All these things were carried into Europe. The basic idea, because the Africans very early, even going back to Tafeti before Egypt, they saw Horus as a Christ figure. Their concept of the Christ was already there long before Jesus was born. You could see it on their temples. We saw that, and it's almost broken and shattered, but it was drawn for us by one of the Egyptian guides, showing the resurrection, showing the angel coming to announce the birth of the child, showing the virgin birth. All those ideas already on Egyptian temples at Luxor, long before Jesus, the Christ, appeared on the earth. Those ideas, those concepts were there. They were to profoundly affect the world. They're not European things. And when you look at the science, that in particular, it is amazing, not only the medicine, but look at the calendar, look at the mathematics. Geometry was developed by the Africans along the Nile. They had to deal with complex problems because of the fluctuations of the Nile. They developed geometry. The Greeks and Romans had arithmetic, but they didn't have geometry, that more complex kind of mathematics. That came out of the Nile Valley. And a range of other things. And the Greeks admitted it. They admitted it. Now Martin Bernal brings out his book, Black Athena. And because he's white, and I'm not saying because Martin Bernal is a very good friend of mine, but I'm just trying to show you the state of mind that exists in this country, that we were saying that, the op was saying that, and nobody was paying attention, but now a white scholar says it. It's a big thing. It's like a sudden discovery. It has validity. Black Athena shows you clearly how 200, 300 years ago, it was accepted what the Greeks had said. These are black people of woolly hair, and they gave us this and that and so forth. That was known as the ancient model. No, they changed it to the Aryan model. The Germans in particular, trying to show that Egypt is a Semitic language or so Indo-Aryan elements and all sorts of things like that, and how the Greeks exaggerated their debt to the Egyptians, because in spite of all their attempts to say that there was nothing black about the Egyptians, they were at least aware there was some black in them. It made them uncomfortable. And therefore there was a long effort, especially after slavery. How can we, as Christians, enslave people who once taught us so much and telling us about how these inferior people and how we're giving them this and giving them that, when if you really studied history objectively, you would find they gave us a great deal. That couldn't be tolerated. You couldn't sleep at night with a Christian conscience thinking that you were enslaving people who were equal in any real sense. They had to be unequal. They had to be inferior. Therefore, they had to be excluded from everything that was of significance. Even when it was found in the heart of Africa, among African people, something could not be accepted. When they found the ruins of Monomotapa, everybody said it was an African kingdom. Everybody said this was an African center in southern Africa. It's 800 years old. But when they saw the building and the marvelous conical tower, and these guys putting together stone in a manner in which it was never put together in Europe, well, it couldn't be by Africans, naturally not. If the Portuguese built it, if the Chinese built it, It's the Phoenicians built it, it's the Arabs built it, not Africans. Wherever they found something, if they found a sophisticated plant, a cultivated plant, somebody brought it. When I was studying African presence in early America, I was corresponding with the South African. He didn't know I was black, because my name Van Sertima, it sounds like a Boer name, it's a Dutch name. Okay, my ancestors were the slaves of the Dutch, because my country was once owned by the Dutch. So he thought I'm Boer like himself. I didn't say he's a Boer, he thought I'm not much different. And so he's writing these things, and I'm collecting this information because he'd found maize had entered Africa, and he couldn't understand how it had entered. And like Leo Wiener, he'd also claimed that blacks must have been in America before Columbus. But it took me a long time to realize what these guys were really saying. Blacks were in America before Columbus, but they were still slaves. They hadn't jumped at all. Because what he was really saying, when eventually he wrote me a letter in which he said, Van Sertima, if you find the yam, the colocasia, and the negro, all three of them West African items in America before Columbus, someone, a human being, must have brought them there. In other words, the blacks were in America because a human being, a white person who could migrate and move, brought these static people into America. Could you understand that? Do you know how deep that is? That is the reason why we have such a hell of a time recovering history. I have students, I teach students in black civilizations. After a whole semester in which I've shown them of all these various methods we've used to reconstruct history, on the plane coming from New Orleans this morning, I'm reading an essay by one of my students in which she is telling me that it's a pity we can never recover this history because we only have the oral tradition, it's unreliable. And she's quoting all of these early white scholars. And the books that she has bought at some expense from me, she wouldn't open the book. Could you understand that? She would not open the book. Now that's not true of many of my students, thank God. But could you imagine that? She has already made up her mind. I'm going to say we did great things, yes, because Van Sertima likes to say that. But I'm going to read the books that were read before, because I don't have validity, I'm black. So it doesn't matter what you say, she would not, and she doesn't even know it. She doesn't know that is what the process that is happening. Can you understand the sickness? That is why we can't be casual about this. This is dead serious stuff. It's as serious as religion. And it is religion because it is making sacred again the human being. It is religious in that regard. Because that blackout, it's a blackout, a whitewash. It is as if Europe has totally overpowered us so that, as I say, we become the invisible man in history. And the whole things that come out to suggest that we're making it all up. Look at all these things. It's detailed. It's so detailed that the great thinkers, the greatest scientists in Europe before Einstein, Isaac Newton, who brought about this tremendous synthesis of all the sciences at that point in time. Do you know what he was doing? Now, he is a genius, I'm not denying that, but even he was cheating. They found a book written on various elements of gravity, written by a Moor. And he had written it of course is an obscure little book, because there was no great printing presses at the time. He's written his Isaac Newton, his book. And he has a lot of writing on it and discussions to himself and so forth. When he died, they found it among his papers. Nobody said anything. Recently, a man in England has brought it to light. Now, Newton was a remarkable man, though, and Newton the astonishment of everyone, including myself, studied Egyptology. Newton said, we thought he got his Egyptian education from Kepler and Copernicus and Galileo. Galileo had used an African water clock in his experiment, and he had been affected by Egypt. But we found that he was actually reading Egyptian texts, and he said there are three things in which some of my work has been prefigured. One, the Egyptians knew about the atom. Of course, it didn't reach the point about atomic fission and fusion. That is a recent development. But he said that they called the atom the monad, and they saw it as the building block of the physical universe, even though they had mystical notions about it. Nobody on earth even dreamt about the atom at that point in time. Not until many centuries later. He said further, he was convinced that they had a sense of gravitational attraction because they talked about the harmony of the spheres, how these things were held in a certain relationship because of these belts of gravitation. Pythagoras came from Egypt with that theory. He'd been there, according to Newton, 22 years. I thought it was 7. This is his own brother, scientist. 22 years he spent in Egypt. And then he said that the Egyptians had a heliocentric theory of the solar system. That is, they knew that the sun was the center and the bodies revolved around the sun. That is why they were able to make such accurate calendars. Do you know in Europe they did not know that? It took a long time before Europe even knew that the earth was not flat. And they had people, intelligent scholars in Europe, telling you that if the earth was wrong, you would fall off. And they would tell you that if the earth was wrong, then there would be people in Australia walking upside down. That was a big concept for them. These are, you see, now we are living on the European power, where the European media overwhelms us and all the books are European, so that we automatically assume, having been born in that prison, that mental prison, we automatically assume these people were on top of the world with all their tremendous intelligence and invention. That is not the case. And it doesn't just end with Egypt. There were other movements by Africans into Europe. Africans were not a static people. Not only had they been there migrating in the very first period, 3 African types migrated until finally the modern type.
Europe is awakening from the Middle Ages and from the Dark Ages. The Africans are still ruling Spain, they still block Europe from the Mediterranean, and yet the storm is gathering in Spain between 2 sets of Africans. And this storm is gathering because the Muslims are beginning to fight among themselves. Portugal frees herself from the domination of the Africans in 1240 because the Africans were the military arm of Spain from 711 to 1240. Because around 1000, the Almoravids under Ibn bin Tishfan enters the scene. Mostly Africans, sprinkling of Arabs. But in the 1000s, but 1240, the Almohades enters. Now you have two competing military groups for the Mediterranean in Spain. In the 1400s, they began to argue among themselves. The Almoravides are puritanical Muslims. The Almohades are mixed with the second Arab invaders who came in from Arabia in the 1000s. They don't care too much about Islam. They're pretending Islam. That was the dumping ground, the waste matter of the Arab world. They're freebooters, marauders, and nobodies. They're coming looking for what they could get. Now, the argument is over customs of Islam. That group goes into Spain and violates all the basic rules of the faith. They not only marry Spanish women, they marry more than 4. A violation of the faith, violation of the custom. They not only marry more than 4, they let the Spanish woman remain in the Catholic Church. If she's good and bad, they don't care whether she stay in the church or not. But the African not only doesn't marry more than 4, but whoever he marries, she have to not only convert to Islam, she must keep a proper Islamic diet. Failing that, he goes home to Africa to get his woman. There wasn't no Catholic woman in his bed, no Catholic woman in his kitchen. He's a Muslim straight away. Because when we get into a thing, we go all the way. We out poke it out, Muhammad. Either do it right or don't do it. Now, the argument now is between these factions. You got Islamic factions arguing. Now, about 1450, this argument is getting heated to the point where one half of Spain under the Castilians have freed themselves from the domination. The Castilians boast that they have no Moorish blood. It's a lie, but that's what they say. All right, now, there was something else that happened earlier. 1415. The Portuguese, who are more independent than the Spaniards, still partly under the domination of the Moors. 1415, the Portuguese invade a part of Africa, a little enclave called Cetra. I used to say it's about the size of Central Park, but then I went to Cetra. It's off the coast of Morocco. It's not as big as Central Park. And they conquered it. And this put hard in Europe. It's been years since the Europeans been able to draw any blood in Africa. Africa had caused them so much fear. And Europeans now begin to get that little courage back again. See, almost 700 years or more, the Africans had penned them into the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean was the sea of the world. The trading sea. Since the days of the Carthaginians, they wanted that sea. Remember during the Roman time, Carthage, when Hannibal blocked their way off, and when they shouted out, Carthage must be destroyed, they just had to have the Mediterranean. They've got to have it right now. It touches on three great cultures. It was the melting pot, the cultural melting pot of the world. They wanted it back again. They wanted to get back into the Mediterranean, back into the trade of the Mediterranean. All right, 1455. We have to go slow right here because something is going to happen. 1455. Spain and Portugal now free enough now to go to the Pope and begin to talk about, we're going to take over the world next. They're so sure of themselves, they're talking about lines of demarcation. Go to the Pope, talking about how we're going to divide up things when we're in charge. In this ensuing conversation before the Pope settles the argument. You are both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people. This account is beautifully told in Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, and told again in his work, The Caribbeans from Columbus to Castro. I don't know what you think about Eric Williams. A whole lot of people didn't think too much of him as the Prime Minister of Trinidad. And a whole lot of people don't forget that Eric Williams, while he may not have been a good Prime Minister of Trinidad, he was one of the best historians ever come out of the Caribbean islands. I knew him personally, and he was a colleague of mine, and knew him enough to fight with him and argue with him and to do. That man knew research. That man knew history. He should never have been a prime minister, because that's my personal opinion. Because I just happen to think that he was out of place as a politician. He should have been in the classroom. He could do more research faster and get more things correctly placed than any historian I know about. He wrote the history of Trinidad and Tobago in 2 months. And wasn't a single error in it. Some writers take 3 years to do a book like that. It's insight into history. And probably in his last years, he wanted to ban his own book, Capitalism and Slavery. I still think it was, in fact, he wanted to put you in jail for bringing it into Trinidad. I still think it's one of the great masterpieces of economic history. And, my main point here is that the Pope had literally sanctioned the mentality that would go into the making of the slave trade. Now, as we move further, something else is going to happen. These are unnoticed events in history. The maps of the Jewish gold merchants who had a monopoly on gold trade in North Africa and the inner Africa called the Western Sudan would fall into the hands of Prince Henry of Portugal, called Henry the Navigator, though there is no evidence that he ever went to sea. He would open a school for chart making and map making. The important thing about the school is that a little-known sailor, Christopher Colon, later called Christopher Columbus, would attend this school. More about him later. All right, now Europe is learning longitude and latitude. Europe has forgotten how to handle ships. The school at Salamanca, run by Africans and Arabs, had began to translate this information from Spain in Spain, translate this information from the leading maritime nation of that day, which is China. Now, taking the material from China, Europe is going back at sea, but Europe is learning something else. Europe is learning intellectual history, also preserved at Salamanca. Europe has forgotten its own masters, has forgotten its philosophers, Aristotle and Plato and all of this has been forgotten. Europe is learning again its own intellectual heritage. Europe will learn this, and Europe will turn on the very people that preserved it for them and say that the people who preserved it for them have no culture, and will keep up that lie to this very day. And you would read the intellectual history of the world without hearing the name Salamanca, the great university in Spain, or the great university in Africa, Saint-Coré. These are the two universities that preserve the great culture of the medieval world that Europe would choose to forget, and did forget. But the most tragic of all, it made you forget them. And when they mention them to you, you have no memory of it. And the greatest crime committed against you was to destroy your confidence in your historical memory of what you have been, so that you can forget what you are and also forget what you still can be. That's what it's all about. And this is why the European is referred to as the evil genius. The game he started then, 500 years ago, he's still playing. Now, if you look at the motion picture now, listen to what I'm saying. Now go back and look at the color purple and understand it now, based on what I'm just saying. You're seeing a new motion picture. You see the game he played. It was a war. That picture was not a motion picture. That picture was a part of a war against your mind. When they turn you on your man.
Convenience is over there. That's what they tell you. And then they tell you, you too much like us white folks. What would you do? How would you live if you go back over there? And some of these old dumb, brainwashed, handkerchief-head, 20th century intellectual Negroes, first thing they tell you when you say something about, let's go back home, I haven't lost anything in Africa. No, you lost it all right here. You came over here with it. When you came over here, you had it. But you lost it. You lost your name. You lost your language. You lost your mind. You lost your culture. Don't tell me you didn't lost your mind. You came over here black-minded. Now you're white-minded. Been brainwashed. All of the color has been taken out of your heart and out of your mind. Now you're running around not satisfied unless you can talk like white folks. Unless you can walk like white folks. Unless you can eat and sleep like white folks. You're a white black man. White on the inside and black on the outside. You're not this and you're not that. Mr. In between. And don't nobody want you, because you don't want yourself. Why, the book says, don't mess with Mr. In between. Nobody wants Mr. In between. You're a middleman. They won't let you be white and you don't want to be black. You don't want to be an African and you can't be an American. So you run around here like a nut on the law, sitting on the bench. You're in bad shape. Imagine the white man telling you and me that Africa is a jungle, and everything over there is backwards. And if you go over there, you won't like the living conditions. How are they living over there? Why, we got to fight them over there to get them out. If it's nowhere over there, why don't they get out of there? Why did Lumumba have to fight to get the Belgians out of the Congo? So it's one of the most beautiful places on this earth. If it wasn't beautiful, the white man wouldn't be there. You got the white man all over there. He's everywhere over there, living like a king. But they're getting ready to send him. Send him. No, it's not a jungle. It's civilized. It's cultured. It's developed. It's intelligent. High moral. High everything. Good people. Friendly people. Hospitable people. Brother to a brother. That's how they kidnapped us. We were too hospitable. We saw the old white man coming over the hill, and we accepted him into our city as a friend. And he shipped us down the river, sold us into bondage. This is one of the greatest mistakes that our people made, opening their doors in hospitality to the white man. And when we first saw him coming, we should have sent him then. And we never would have had to catch the hell we've been catching over here in America for the past 400 years. When he came to Africa, he came from the jungle to civilization. Because the jungle was in Europe. Savages were in Europe. Cannibals were in Europe. Cannibals weren't in Africa. Cannibals were in Europe. White people were up there eating each other up. They still eat each other up. You've seen these berries and things running around here. Those are white people. That's the way they live. They're cannibals. They're savages. They have no morals. They used to live in the cave. They walked on their all fours. They were naked like animals. They couldn't walk upright. They didn't wear clothes. They didn't cook their food. Why, they ate raw meat. They still like their meat rare. Rare. Raw. That's the dog in them, brother. That's the animal in them, brother. Now they're a race of cave dwellers. Didn't know how to bury their dead. For 2,000 years they lived up in the caves of Europe. And during that time, your and my people were living in luxury, living with high culture, living in a high civilization. Why, Africa is the root of civilization. Africa is the home of civilization. Africa's been civilized a long time. They have all kinds of civilizations in Africa. They have the Egyptian civilization, the Carthaginian civilization, the Mali Empire, the empires of Benin, of Mali, Songhai. Why, you can call out empires all day long from the African continent that were at a high state of culture when these blue-eyed things were crawling around up in Europe, living in huts, eating raw meat. I love to talk about it. I do. I love to talk about it. Yes, I love to talk about it. Talk about them like a dog. And they should be able to take it. Now they know how we feel. Why, when I was a little boy, they called me nigger so much, I thought that was my name. That's all they knew how to call you. Now they get an inkling of how we feel, and the chickens that they sent out there are coming home to roost. They are a race of cave dwellers, raw meat eaters, naked, no clothes wearers. That's where they came from. They are not fit to be walking around here telling you to look like they do, or imitate them. No, they learned civilization from you. They learn culture from you. They learn how to wear clothes from you. They learn how to cook their food from you. They learn mathematics from you. They learn science from you. Why, the black man in Africa has mastered the arts and sciences. Way back yonder, he mastered the mathematical sciences, the astronomical sciences, to the extent where he could plot the course of the stars in the universe when this old white blue-eyed thing didn't even know that the earth was round. He just found out the earth was round.
A group of children in Europe decided that if the adults have failed, we will go and rescue the Holy Grail. We will go across Europe and do what they failed to do. And this is the last and the most tragic of all of the crusades, the Children's Crusade. The most tragic crusade in history. 250,000 children, maybe a little more, marched across Europe. These kids were sincere, dedicated Christian children, marched across Europe saying that they would go and rescue the Christian ornamentations in the holy places. Adults integrated themselves with the kids ostensibly to help them. About half of them froze to death, died of hunger. And when they got to the warm waters of the Mediterranean in the spring, they discovered that the adults came in to help them were really slave traders who sold the rest to the infidel Arabs that they were supposed to be fighting. One of the tragic events in human history. Now, if the African understood that event, if the Africans had insight and understood what the Europeans were doing to the Europeans, he could have saved himself from the slave trade. So if these people would do that to their children, there's nothing for me to expect. And when the European hit his shore, he'd have killed them on sight. That would have been the end of that. He wasn't alerted to it. He was still hung up with the fact that if I have humanity, somebody else come, I'll treat him like he's a human being because I'm a human being. He invited him for dinner. Treat him like a guest. He ended up being a slave. That same kind of sentiment is still among African people to this very day. The Aztecs in Mexico did the same thing with Cortez, and he took over Mexico. Less than 2,000 men took over all Mexico. Came as a guest, stayed as the conqueror. We non-Western people never learned. Hadn't learned to this very day. They don't want you to be anything with them. Once they destroy the effectiveness of the image of your men, there's nothing they want you to be with them but a whore and a slut. End of a people. That's the end of a people. And that's what they're trying to achieve, to destroy a people totally. But they will recruit a people to help them do it, and they are having some success in that recruitment. Now, Henry the Navigator's school is training Europe to move back at sea. Now we will have to deal with another neglected date in history. Not 1492, 1482. 1482, Europeans came again along the coast of Ghana under the leadership of D'Azarara, Portuguese. They wanted now to establish permanent fortifications. In the establishment of permanent fortifications, King Asa of Ghana tried to discourage them. He understood what was happening. And his famous speech is in a number of books, especially W.W. Claridge's 2-volume work, A History of the Gold Coast and Ashanti. It's again in J.C. de Graaf Johnson's African Glory. It's in a number of books. When he came along the coast, literally demanding to build permanent fortifications in Ghana, he discouraged it. He said that formerly you have come among us complaining about the weather, saying that we had no conditions under which you could live, Now you come in splendid attire. Now they will come all dressed up and saying they were sent by the gods. Now they're saying that they're coming to rule now. They want permanent fortifications. And what did they want to build? Elmina Castle, the largest slave fortress in all Africa. I was there this summer. Elmina, the mine. They want the gold, they want the yellow gold, and they want the black gold. Slaves. And while he tried to discourage them, he wanted to engage in legitimate trade as before. He said, in that way, if we see each other infrequently, we can preserve our friendship. They wasn't buying it. And when he wouldn't buy the Bible story, they forced their way in. Offshore, 500 troops. And in this, among these troops and sailors, a little-known soldier, little-known sailor, Christopher Colon. Later known, Christopher Columbus. Read Columbus's diary, and he says, as man and boy, I sailed up and down the Guinea coast for 23 years. What was Christopher Columbus doing up and down the Guinea coast for 23 years? He was in the early Portuguese slave trade. This man might be one of the biggest fakers and one of the biggest con men in history. Why didn't he go to the East Indies with Isabella's money and Isabella's endorsement? Why did he go to the West Indies in the first place? What did he know about going to the West Indies? What did he learn about the West Indies? He learned from African sailors who had already gone to the West Indies. Then that's proof that African sailors had already gone to the West Indies. They told him how to pick up a sea current. You pick up a sea current someplace along that coast, it would take you straight to the West Indies. You have to wait 6 months, it reverses itself and bring you back. That's why ships were wrecked off the coast of Portugal on his way home. He may well have double-crossed Isabella. He double-crossed his sailors too, because he made them sign a paper saying that he was in the East Indies, and if they didn't sign, he wanted to cut their tongues out. All of this is documented. Read Van Sertima's They Came Before Columbus. Read it again. Read it carefully. But there's a 3-volume work also, hard to get now, Africa in the discovery of America. But there's other works on the subject. There's a whole small library of books dealing with the pre-Columbian presence of Africans in the New World. There's a new book coming out right now at the University of California. Christopher Columbus discovered absolutely nothing. Never set foot on North America or South America. He opened up North America, South America for European exploitation. But the great tragedy was the entry of 1482. The building of Elmina Castle, the building in the beginning of permanent fortifications for Europeans. And another aspect of the slave trade forgotten was the entry of the Scandinavians and the entry of the Dutch. These wooden shoe wearing people who were so clean, grow 2 lips, who so clean they even named a cleanser after them, Dutch cleanser, one of the bloodiest, murderous slave traders that you can think about. So the coming of the Europeans was one of the disastrous acts of history. When people are telling you about their Holocaust, all you have to say is that when you finish talking about your 6 million, I'll start my count with 60 million, and I'm just starting my count. We talk about Holocaust the same as we talk about fish stories. Those who caught the biggest fish do the most talking. I was at Elmina Castle, and I was at Goree Islands. Goree Island, one of the smaller of the slave folks, 20 million just passed that one. They got 46 castles. 20 million passed through Goree. I was at Elmina, the biggest one. There's no counting of how many passed through Goree, passed through Elmina. That's the monster. Its first dungeon holds 1,000. This the dungeon for the women holds 500. Just for the women. Had one compartment for the virgin girls, for the ship's captains and the governors to pick their choice which one they wanted to rape that night. That holds 250. So the coming of the Europeans, one of the great tragedies then in the history of the whole world. Now the economy of Africa is getting the economy of Europe off the ground. Europe now is emerging from the tragedy of the Middle Ages. It's emerging people poor, resource poor, and land poor. It's emerging into the world, and there is nothing for Europe to feed on within Europe. Europe has tried to enslave Europeans. It didn't work. Europeans hasn't got the physical energy to bring it off. The Africans, fortunately, have the physical energy to bring it off, and still have the physical energy. Europeans have treated Europeans so badly that when they try to enslave other Europeans to do the work, the Europeans can't bring it off physically. They cannot last. It does not mean that the Africans did not die wholesale. They did. But you had a reservoir to get more Africans. You just simply go back to the European reservoir. You got another weakling. He didn't have enough strength to hold up under the pressure of this grueling business. And it kept on and on. Nobody spared him, and nobody showed him any mercy. All right, the business was around France, it was around England, it was around Portugal, and Spain. The British were kept out of the business, not out of any benevolence, because of an argument the British had with the Catholic Church. The French had some difference of opinion with the church and did not enter the business until that holy devil, Cardinal Richelieu, gave France a rationale to get into the business. Then France got into the business. Someone gave Henry VIII's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, a a proposal for England's getting into the slave trade, and she rejected it. Then someone showed her how much profit could be made. Then she accepted it. Then the lead ship in the British entry into the slave trade was her personal property, the good ship Jesus. That was the name. Now, among the female power brokers of Europe, Elizabeth stands out. But don't forget who she was and what she did. Europe had practically no great outstanding women power brokers. And the one they did have was Elizabeth. She knew how to handle power. But in handling it, don't forget what she did to us and how she handled that power and how that power was directed. Finally, once the British broke clear of the Catholic Church, the British no longer had to secure what is called the Isientos, literally permission to engage in the trade. Now, the British went into the business with a vengeance. The British, led by Captain Hawkins, moved into the business with a vengeance. And when the British got into the business, it became a business. It was no longer sloppy. They drove the Portuguese out of West Africa. The Portuguese moved down to the Congo, subsequently Angola. And now the British pressured them. The French moved in. The British said, show me the clause in Adam's will that says I'm not entitled to my share of this African gold. And the French said, who gave the Pope right to give away what wasn't his in the first place? Francis of France. Now everybody now was bidding for a share of Africa. Look at the Portuguese in the Congo. They came to the Congo ostensibly to establish a partnership. And the Africans, believing them, did establish a partnership. Finally, the Africans who had taken Portuguese names, adopted the religion, Portuguese customs, realized that the Portuguese were trying to change the Congo into a slave colony, turned on the Portuguese and did a remarkable thing, remarkable in African history, remarkable in human history, drove them out and established the Congo as a free country in the 1590s. And the Congo remained free from the 1590s until 1884. In the 1600s, a great king came to power, Shamba Belongongo. And from 1600 on, next 20 years, they not only threw away the Portuguese religion, threw Portuguese cooking utensils into the sea, tore down the Portuguese churches, went back and became purely African, and had a golden age. Built again the Bashongo kingdom. There were two kingdoms, the kingdom of the Congo and Bashongo. And they came together now and brought that strength together. The eastern Congo and the Congo facing the sea. the most remarkable thing, right in the midst of the slave trade and in spite of it. And all of this is forgotten. And yet it is well written about it. Belanger's daily life in the Kingdom of the Congo, but principally Taude's work on the trail of the Bashongo. No shortage of books about it. And yet it is unknown. The Portuguese moved to what is now Angola, faced a king who wasn't ready to fight them, and his sister kept holding his hands, hoping that he'd get ready. His sister, Nzinga, because his sister held his hand, the Portuguese thought she was for them. She was holding his hand until she could get ready. Because he didn't get ready in time, she just finally pushed him aside and got ready herself. She fought the Portuguese 52 of her 81 years, giving no quarter, asking no quarter. One of the greatest of the African warrior queens. She was from a group called the Jajars. She wanted to stretch an empire across the southern belly of Africa. She became a Christian strategically, using it the way they use it. Strategically, for her purpose. Went to Portugal for a treaty, saw people hungry. She said, you people don't live no Christianity. What are these people doing hungry? What kind of Christians are you? So we wouldn't permit this in our country. She peeped their card. She knew they were liars. Then she put one against the other. She bought guns from the Portuguese and bought guns from the Dutch and then some from the Finns. She manipulated them. Finally, they tried to force her into a battle. She wasn't ready for it. And again, they killed her sister and threw the mangled body of her sister at the palace door. Near the end of her life, she was forced to fight a battle that she didn't want. It ended up being neither victory or defeat. But this woman kept the Portuguese from the hinterlands of Angola for most of her life and kept the slave trade from spreading into Angola. The last of the great monumental female warriors of this part of Africa. And yet, forgotten in history. But they know her. They know they met a warrior. J. Rogers did a pretty good biography of her, but the best biography of her is written, was in French and it hadn't been translated, written by the young writer from Guinea, a personal friend of mine, Abraham Baby KK. But we need to, I did a long article in Essence about 5-6 years ago. No, about 10 years ago now, 75. That's 12 years. Oh God, things go fast. But no, in Southern Africa, the Dutch East India Company needed a filling station. And that filling station was really found they needed a filling station for those stopping en route to India. The French Huguenots had been there before. Others had been there before, but that was the reason Southern Africa was found. And there were some dissident people in Holland, Calvinists. You have to understand the Calvinists were religious dissidents and who think that God ordained them to look over the lesser breeds, and they declared that Africans are lesser breeds. And many of the Jews who had been in Spain helped to establish the Dutch East India Company and owned stock in the Dutch East India Company. After the Portuguese were driven out of the Congo and were forced partly out of Angola, they came around to establish themselves in what is now Zimbabwe and Mozambique. Then they met the Arab slave trade moving down from the north, and they established a partnership with the Omani Arabs, and they sold a lot of the slaves that went to Brazil were sold to the Portuguese by the Arabs. If you saw that fourth segment of the Africans when Al-Mazrui rationalized the Arab slave trade, he said there's only 2 million in the Arabian Peninsula, and kept asking, where did these slaves go? He wouldn't dare ask that stupid question to somebody who knows the history. Many of these slaves went to India, some even went to China, but a lot of them were sold to the Portuguese and went to the New World. A lot of them are in Brazil today because the Arab slave trade went into the millions, and it's now just 2 million. If you read UNESCO documents too, you will see some good statistics on the Arab slave trade. But the brothers who belong to the faith still haven't been willing to do this because they haven't been willing to deal in depth with the Arab slave trade. But the coming of the Europeans to East Africa was met with the Portuguese developed not only a slave trade in East Africa, but entered a partnership with the Arab slave trade. Now let's deal with North Africa, because we want to deal with the coming of the Europeans to the total of Africa. In North Africa, then part of the Ottoman Empire of the Turks, the Europeans, the Turks were Europeans, but then the Turks were challenged by the French and the English. When the Turks were challenged by the French and the English, you see a new kind of colonialism being overlaid by that one kind of colonialism challenging another kind of colonialism. Now you see competition between slave traders and slave traders, and Africans caught in a vice of history, and competition between traders and traders. And the European, especially the British, controlling the business more and more. The absentee European now entering the business. You can now buy ships in the business without seeing the ships. You can buy plantations without seeing the plantations. You have slave stock on the British exchange. You got the birth of Lords of London gambling on the exchange. Then you have the birth of something that's going to change the system. You have the U.S. that began to make a faster ship. And the U.S. that had been buying slaves from England and partly from the Portuguese, the U.S. is now making its own ships and sending its ships directly to Africa. Now a competitor, and a ruthless competitor, has entered the slave trade. And not only a ruthless competitor in the slave trade, but a person that would change the whole system of trading. And the plantation system of the Caribbeans, this system is opening wider, because formerly the proving ground for the slave system in the Western world, the Caribbean islands, but the dumping ground for the Portuguese trade was South America, principally Brazil. But Brazil was a resale point for South America, but the resale point for the United States was the Caribbean islands. With the U.S. challenging the British trade, the widening of the gap, in the competition is now becoming a thing, a worldwide system. The main thing that we need to look at is that this system, endorsed by the church, was the first international economy that touched 3 continents, and that out of this system came the basic commodity that laid the foundation for the modern technical capitalist world. And when you are making claims on the world, when you are making claims for reformation, when you are making claims for what is due you and your children in the world, your claims are too small, for they took away from you and drained away from you all the means that you could have had to have been nations, to have built empires, to have built schools, to have built Harvards, to have built Cambridges, to have built empires, to have built navies, and put you 500 years behind in technology. But what they took away from us laid the basis for the modern technical world. And I remember in Washington a few months ago, some German coming to a meeting came up to me sheepishly, halfway apologetically, and said, other immigrant groups in America pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. Why haven't your race done the same thing? I lost my cool and said, because someone stole our boots, you bigoted SOB. Now, when you look at the economy, when you look at the skyscrapers, when you look at all the diamonds people have, when you look at people flaunting Rolls Royces. You look at the economy of the Western world, except for the slave trade, it might be there in some form, but it would not be there quite that way, except for what they took from us. And you have to say that it belonged to me once in some way. Our mission for our children is going to have to be to get it all back. across is that in the 8th century to the 12th century, so the intellectual emergence of Europe, at a time Egypt was in its 23rd dynasty and dying after nearly 10,000 years of some forms of organized society, Europe intellectually was just being born. And I further maintain that Europe in general had nothing to do with the creation of Rome and Greece, and yet the challenge of Rome and Greece created Europe, because they were scattered tribes, and the challenge of Rome and Greece brought them together, and they became a people strong enough to create a state. If anybody got any information to the contrary, state the information to the contrary. I maintain that there was no Europe. You're giving Europe credit for things that happened before the first European war. Shoe or lived in a house that had a window. And I'm saying that you have not read, not just Massey, Joe Massey, his European disciple, Churchward, Signs and Symbols of Primordial Man, the Origins of Religions, and his extensive work on Freemasonry. You've not read the American disciple of Massey, Alvin Boyd Kuhn, is Who is This King of Glory? One of the best written books on the Christ story, when he proves that the basis of European spirituality was taken directly from Africa.
Professor Rogers, would you like to follow on your question?
No one is actually maintaining that literary Greek culture pre-existed any number of Near Eastern cultures. Again, I find it a bit curious that...
Except Egypt is physically a part of Africa, created by the Africans from the south.
Even if I concede or admit or agree with you that Egypt is part of Africa, what I'm about to say, my point was going to be that the most recent scholarship about the genesis of those two oral epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, points in fact in another direction to influence, and that is in fact the Hittite Empire, whose documents we can read very easily, and there may well be independent confirmation of the historicity of some form of a Trojan War in those documents. And so what I'm really asking is, why is it that we're just really looking in one direction when we're talking about the origins of Greek civilization?
When Alexander entered Egypt, he wrote home to his mother and said that he at last reached the land where the Greek gods began, Apollo and Zeus. And he wanted to consult one of the great African teachers of oracles. And the oracle asked, "How old is this man?" He said, 32. They said, in 20 years, maybe he'll be wise enough to ask me a question that I care to answer.